Well, good morning and welcome to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation's Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. We have an awesome session for you today. Today's educator is none other than Brandon Robertson, or should I say Professor Brandon Robertson. And the topic is left hand shapes for bass. I just want to remind everyone that you're going to be muted upon entry, and we appreciate your cooperation to remain muted for the courtesy of others. And if you have any questions, you can always use that chat feature down there. Please post questions, anything you want to ask, and we'll reserve some time at the end to ask the questions to the educator. We hope you enjoy today's sessions. There's more upcoming free sessions that we posted at www.clearwaterjazz.com/education. And don't forget, your feedback on any future session topics are always welcome. You can email us at info@clearwaterjazz.com. So I'm excited about today, but before we jump into it, we want to thank our sponsors. Be sure to check out the studio archive of the past video sessions at clearwaterjazz.com education and outreach section. This is brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management at Stewart Partners and Duke Energy. Don't forget about the Young Lions podcast is streaming wherever you can check out streams. And this is brought to us by our friends at Marine Max Clearwater. Just search Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Session. So just some of the past sessions that Professor Robertson has given. We have Where Do I Begin? How about how to develop melodic bass lines? That was a great one. Playing duo performances. Practice for 2 hours a day. Only 2? Just 2. Okay. Constructing bass lines part 1 and 2. So if you're a bass player, I mean, there's a wealth of information you can go back. And we love that conversation that you had with Jameson Ross. So just a little bit about Brandon. He is an Emmy-nominated music director and a professional upright electric bassist. He's a composer and music educator, originally from none other than Tampa, Florida. He completed his Bachelor's of Arts in Music from Florida State in 2009 and a Master's in Music and Jazz Studies in the spring of 2016. Currently, he's a Director of Jazz Studies and Director of the FGCU Basketball Band at Florida Gulf Coast University of Fort Myers, Florida. In 2018, he was nominated for an Emmy Award for Best Documentary for Educational Collegiate Programs, featuring none other than the FGCU Jazz Ensemble. So he is a band leader. He recently had a great performance. He'll probably tell you a little bit more about that. And guess what? He's performed with some of the greats of the greats. From Jason Marcellus, we're talking Carmen Bradford, Marty Morell, and Wyclef Gordon. The list goes on and on. So we thank you for being with us, Brandon. And
thank you.
Hey, they probably don't know this, but maybe they do. He released an album, his debut album, and that's called Based on a True Story. That was released in 2019. Go out there and check him out on iTunes or wherever you can find the streaming and purchase and support these artists. So guess what, Brandon? The stage is all yours.
Man, this is a pretty big stage to fill, so I'm going to try my best after that introduction. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And to the entire foundation, the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, I love you guys very much, and thank you all for always having me back. So for today's masterclass, here's what we are going to have going on. I want to talk about the left hand. Now, it's very important that everybody knows that the left hand does 2 things. It helps produce your sound, because without the sound, without you pressing down on the string, you produce no sound. The left hand also helps you keep the dexterity and the logic of how to fundamentally maneuver around the bass, and specifically around the fingerboard. Now, what I want to talk about, when I mean by left shapes, I see a lot of young bass players play like this. I call this the quack quack hand. You guys ever see ducks at the pond? Some of you from the Tampa Bay area, you have that nice little pond near downtown. It's very beautiful, right? See the nice little ducks walk across the street. They got the little baby ducks, right? And then sometimes when you come close to it, it'll go quack quack. It'll make that sound, right? Well, the flap of their mouths are like this. And if I were to take this shape, or I'll do it like this. I'll do it in my left hand. And if I flip it, that's what that looks like. So, we call it the quack quack hand. Now, I won't necessarily go on the record and say that band or orchestra directors or jazz directors, people around the country are going around calling their students quack quacks and ducks. That's not what's going on. But what I'm trying to describe here is this is the shape that most young bass players make because they don't fundamentally know the correct hand shape. And when you pick your fingers up, what that does, it changes the tone. Now, there's two things about playing the bass that you have to be very aware of. And it's the most important thing. It's your sound and your tone. Those two things matter. This matters just as much, your technique in both your right and your left hand. But your sound and your tone is the most important and the most essential element you need to be a proficient and clear bass player. Okay, so all my young bass players who are going to watch this, you need to understand that your sound and your tone is what everyone is going to associate you with. So if you have great technique in your left hand, per se, the right hand shape, your sound will come through a lot rounder. Your tone will come through a lot clearer. So every note you play, you get this nice ring versus this. You get that. That's what I hear most of the time. So let's talk about this. Now, I teach my current bass students at the university about shapes. I tell them to think guitar players are some of the best musicians in terms of the shapes of their hands and how they're able to create chords. Now, we understand that aside from pianists, the guitar can emulate that chordal sound on their instrument. Hence, they need to have certain shapes in their left hand in order to do so. So I always refer to them as to not necessarily think like a guitar, but have the transfer of their left hand. And how you see their hand shape is always in a curved manner, okay? The fingers are always on top of the string, okay? Their left hand, or at least they're sitting down, so they're obviously horizontal. So like they're like this, but their shape, their wrist is still the same underneath as it would be if you flipped your hand up. So once I was able to show them that transfer, now they understand how to pick their hand up and keep their hand on top of the string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lean forward a little bit so everyone can see it. Now, I always tell them about the spacing in between your left hand. Each of these spaces matter because on the bass, especially if you're playing on a bass that doesn't, some young basses will have tape or they'll have some markers that'll indicate where the positions are. But if you're a student who doesn't have that on your instrument, you need to understand that there are steps. Now, the further up the bass you are, the larger those steps are. So the hand shape does matter in terms of how much space you have in your left hand. So from here to here, that's a whole step. From here to here, in this little space between your middle finger and your ring finger is the half step. That half step position is probably more important because you can be just a millimeter of a decimal off and be flat or sharp, depending on where how your hand is shaped. So I always tell them, rule of thumb, for starters, to fix your left hand, there's a couple of things that you can do. My teacher always taught me how to do the spider crawl. So you kind of hop in between each strings like this. Hop in between like that. And then what you're doing is you're working on trying to keep the knuckles curved. All right, you want those knuckles to stay curved. Those knuckles stay curved, it makes your hands, it takes a lot of the pressure off the palm of your hand. So that way your hand doesn't get tired if you're squeezing on the string. Because that's what I hear from a lot of young bass players, like, my hand hurts. I was like, well, because we're choking the string. You don't need to choke the string. You just need to apply enough weight on top of the string to where you have to contact, where your fingers have contact with the string onto the fingerboard. So if you do that, you get that sound. When you do the opposite of that, you get that, when you get that little buzz. And it's kind of like there's weight in your fingers. And that's why I always stress about keeping your knuckles kind of pointing and not collapsed, okay? So now demonstrating that, I was stating earlier that I tell my students about their left-handed thing like a guitar, and on bass, it's a lot easier because the shapes that you make create intervals. So if you understand and learn that this shape makes this interval, no matter where you play it on the bass, at least from fret 1 till about 12, which will be where your harmonics are, you can play that same shape and it'll create the same interval. So for instance, I'm gonna start with C, because C has no sharps, no flats. So I'm gonna play a major third interval, okay? So if you play C with your fourth finger, you see how all 4 fingers are down. If I move my top 2 fingers over, I'm in a half position shape at this point. Now, here's the key. You always want to have 3 to 4 notes in one hand position. Say it again. You always want to have 3 to 4 notes in one hand position. This is how you create those shapes and those intervals. So if I were to play the first 4 notes of the C major scale, that's 4 notes in this one hand shape. So I'll demonstrate. The only time I really moved my whole hand is when I went to move from C to F. That's 4 steps, that's 4 notes away from the root. So therefore, this one hand shape was able to play 3 notes at the same time without me physically having to move my whole entire hand. That's the key. When you see a lot of bass players, I've been asked this question a lot. Man, when are you moving your hand? Because your hand looks like it's not moving. Because I have been taught that these shapes will help me create certain intervals where I don't have to do a lot of moving around and I can just stay in the same hand shape, okay? So that shape here, when I move my 2 fingers over to the next string, that's a major third. If I move my hand up a half step, still a major third. Still a major third. Same hand shape, right? Now, check this out. If I only move my middle finger back over to the other string and keep my index on the other string, now I've changed it to a minor third. So this is another step that I tell my students. Those half step positions matter, because if you're thinking about the chromatic scale, these are all half steps apart. So if you're looking at it from a major, if I just go down another half step, now I have a minor. Same thing. So once I was able to demonstrate that, now my current students have a fundamental systematic way of how they walk without doing a lot of this. They're doing a lot of hopping around because they don't know how to move, okay? So that's one shape. Those are 2 shapes that you can do. This is the major third. Now, if you reverse these fingers, so you move your first finger over to the other string, and then you move these 3 fingers over to the other string, like this. So before I was like this. Now I'm going to reverse and move over. Now I have a perfect 5th. But then if I move my 3 fingers over to the last string, now I have an octave. So those shapes, to my young bass players who always ask me, I don't know where the position is. This is the reason why when you're reading your scale books, they have these fingerings. They have these numbers on top of the notes. That's what that's implying. Now, most of you who are watching this probably already knew that. But if you did not know, or if you don't understand why they write those fingerings, that is the case. Those fingerings create those shapes that I'm referencing to. So once you understand that shape makes that fingering, then you will be totally fine in terms of how to move and without having to struggle with that, okay? So going like this, for instance, going like this. So major, minor, okay? Then switch fingers, then you have 5th. But then if you move your second finger back over here, now you have tritone, which is a sharp 4. So these shapes matter too, because again, they're half steps apart. Now, as you can see, the shape in my 2 bottom fingers here, those have to be on top, okay? They have to be on top. If they don't stay on top, then what will happen, you get this kind of percussive sound. It just starts buzzing. So you got to make sure that these 2 bottom fingers here are always on top of the string. Never drop the bottom fingers flat, okay? Now, I'm going to demonstrate to you how this works. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to play a transcribed lick that I took from a Christian McBride solo. I'm going to play it very slowly, but I'm going to show you the shape that he has to make to play this particular line. Now, it took me a minute to figure out how he was playing this because he plays it very fast, and I never try to slow down music. I try to hear it in real time because that is the most effective way that I'll be able to effectively play it if I hear it how it's supposed to sound and not kind of speeds that are slower. So when I took this particular lick, I realized, I was like, oh wow, he's playing a chord. He's actually playing, he's outlining it, but when I went to do the shape, I was like, wow, this is the shape like a guitar player, like how a guitar player would strum this chord. So it made me have an aha moment, like, wow, okay, so that's why folks like bass players like Buster Williams, or bass players like Sean Moffett, or bass players like Ron Carter, where you see videos of them, they know how to play these very intricate chords on the bass, and you're like, how are they doing that? And it's the shapes. They figured out that these shapes make these same chords, and if I'm able to construct my hand in the same position, I will be able to do that anywhere on the bass. Okay, so this is from a blues, from an E-flat blues that he plays. Forget the name of the blues, so please forgive me off the top of my head, but it's off the album Out of Nowhere. It's a trio record with Ulysses Owens and Christian Sands. And he does this lick. It's an E-flat diminished. That's the triad that he's outlining. Now, the particular lick that he's playing is this. That's the lick that he plays. Now, I'm playing it very slowly because I want to show you how those shapes matter. Now, if he played it the way some other folks would hear, a young bass player would kind of hear that, and you would think, oh, I could play it like this because you're only taught up in this region. So if you're doing you see how it's like it's kind of all over the place. So your train of thought will not be able to match how to play that particular line without having to do a lot of work. So what he did was he's like, okay, I figured I could play the shape like this. That's the shape that he has in his hand. So if you strum it, that is a E flat diminish. You have the root, you have the minor third, and you also have the other minor third of the A natural on top, right? So you have this now. So now if I move it up just a half step, go up another half step. So that's what I mean in terms of once you figure out what the shape is, it makes it a lot easier for you to facilitate. Okay? So my second and last point is when you're walking a blues, for instance. I always try to have my bass students say, test yourself in your left hand when you make these shapes by playing a real simple blues. The easiest blues that you can facilitate those kind of shapes and do that with is B flat and F, because you can start on your two lower strings. Okay? If you try to start on C, then that's going to kind of require you, if you're not familiar with how the blues work, it's going to require you to do some shifting. So those two particular blues, your open strings will become a lot handy, so you don't have to do a lot of moving. So I'm going to demonstrate that real quick. Okay, so if I was doing F, the whole entire blues I can play in this this whole hand shape here. Okay, and I understand that these shapes create certain intervals to where I don't have to move a lot. Okay, so that's pretty much my point for today. Just to kind of recap, the most important thing is that your left hand, the shapes that you make, help produce your sound and your tone. So if you struggle with both, you're going to not have an opportunity to play in tune or play really flat like this. Okay? So that pretty much concludes what I have going on right now. And yeah.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much for that awesome information that you shared with us. So a couple quick questions. Aside from transcribing, are there any technical studies out there for a young bass player to kind of get out of that first position and get out of having to jump around a lot, to get used to shifting? Because then we know some young players, they start maybe on the orchestra side, and I know that's a different type of training. So what kind of technical studies would you say are out there that are good to look into?
So I would recommend the John Patitucci 60 Melodic Etude book. That book, you go through it goes through every single scale, and it's written out as an etude, like a jazz etude. So on bass, it requires you to arco. So for bass players who do not arco, that's the best book for you to get and venture right into it. For those of you who are already playing arco and play jazz bass, this is a wonderful book for you to inquire for more technical proficiency with the bow and your intonation, and also in your left hand, your technique in your left hand. It's very melodic. That's why it's called the melodic 60 etudes. And it also goes through every scale for each chord. So for instance, it'll have like melodic minor mode scales, harmonic minor mode scales, natural minor, augmented, diminished, Dorian, natural minor, you name it, man. It goes through all of them, and they have etudes for all of them, for each scale. So that's a book that I would recommend. The Carl Flesch scale system. It's a green book. It says Carl Flesch. It's a basis, and that book goes through a different series of rhythmic scalar exercises. So for instance, in the key of C, it'll go like kind of a it'll go through triplets, 16ths, 8ths, dotted 8ths, 16ths. It'll go through different rhythmic patterns, but just the scale. So that book is kind of working with you on proficient rhythm. And then also the scale itself, figuring out different ways to play it. Here, it'll start the scale in the second quadrant, then it'll move up to the third quadrant, and then it'll end in the thumb position. So those two books are the ones I would highly recommend.
Now, I noticed you mentioned about hand placement. Have you ever had students that they've developed a bad habit of hand placement and just producing good sound? What were some of the things that you did to kind of help them get out of that bad routine to get back on track? And how long does it usually take to break that habit of maybe, your fingers not being in the right place and things like that?
So I have a lot of students who started on electric and switched from electric to upright. So that's why I described the duck hand first, because this kind of technique is okay for electric. I'm not saying that you have to play flat like this, but it wouldn't necessarily damage your technique in terms of getting around the instrument, because the neck is a lot smaller. So your hand obviously wrapping around can do a lot more. So I would say that after about maybe a month, if they practice with their hand on top of the string like this and doing this effectively, then they should be able to break that habit. But then I was going to say too, it also depends on the student, because I've seen both sides of it, where the student will want to keep their hand like this, and then it just doesn't fix itself. And then I have students who, after 2 weeks, their hand is like this, and their intonation like changes. It's like now they can start hearing themselves like, oh wow, I didn't know I sound like that. That's exactly what will happen if you change your hand. So to answer your question, the most effective way, and I'd say after like a month and a half, playing the bass is very hard. It's not an instrument that you can just do in 2 weeks and you say, okay, I think I got it. Like, it doesn't work that way. You have to, I tell my students, you have to practice every day. Like, for every day you don't practice, you lose a couple of days of retention of stuff that you was working on. So it's not going to work out for you. So to answer your question, for the left hand, they have to practice these exercises like that spider crawl I was showing, or practicing making those shapes, so their hand knows what to do. If it doesn't do that, if they keep playing like this, what ends up happening is they'll end up creating carpal tunnel in their right there in their wrist, because there's a tendon, this whole tendon right here that's connected to these two fingers. That muscle, that's the most sensitive muscle in your hand. So, or at least when you're playing bass, that's the most sensitive part of your hand. So that's the part that most bass players, if you see bass players, they'll go like this. They're rubbing that muscle because that's where the most tension is, because you got to think you're pressing in from your thumb. That's a lot of weight. Believe it or not, it may not look like it, but you got one finger trying to produce a massive amount of weight and resistance against something, versus your fingers kind of balancing that weight out. So that's why a lot of students will play flat like this, because it feels better. But over time, you're actually going to make your hand hurt more when you start playing it in the right shape, because your hand was so used to playing flat, and now you're extracting that muscle, and now you feel it. It'll feel real tense. Okay, so I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
well, it sounds like the bass is a pretty physical activity. I'm pretty sure trumpet is a good instrument to learn as well, to not have to
Right.
go into that. But no, also, with the bass is so very important. I mean, being in the rhythm section, I know when I hear groups, that rhythm section sets the tone of the whole entire performance. So, bass players, whether you're seasoned or new, please listen to this great information that Professor Brandon has put out here, because you are the foundation of what we're hearing in all of these performances. So that was some great information. I learned a lot with the different changes, and I know this is not an overnight process. And like you explained,
Right.
it takes daily
Right.
practice and just a lot of transcribing and listening. So we want to thank you
Exactly.
again for this great session. I want to remind everyone, you can always go to our website, www.clearwaterjazz.com/education, and check out all these great sessions. Please, please, please go out and tell
Yeah.
other people the things you're hearing here with Clearwater Jazz, and invite more people. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. All right.
Thank you
Have an
guys.
awesome day, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thank y'all.